The security cameras caught the exact moment 3 armed men kicked in the clinic doors, taking a terrified nurse hostage at gunpoint. They thought they had cornered a weak, defenseless woman. They didn't know Nurse Sarah Taylor had spent 6 years in JSOC. By midnight, she wouldn't just survive. She'd clear the room. The rain had been coming down in relentless heavy sheets for hours, turning the small parking lot of Oakhaven Urgent Care into a slick black mirror. It was 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of night where the world felt entirely abandoned, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hollow dripping of a leaky gutter outside. Inside, Nurse Sarah Taylor was leaning against the nurse's station, a lukewarm cup of black coffee resting against her palm. To anyone looking, she was the picture of an overworked, underpaid healthcare worker. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled, her blonde hair was pulled into a messy utilitarian bun, and her posture was slumped with the universal exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. She was 32, petite and soft-spoken. Earlier that evening, she had spent 20 minutes gently coaxing a frightened 5-year-old named Leo to hold still for a tetanus shot. Now Leo and his mother Evelyn were the only patients left in the waiting area, waiting out the storm before making the drive home. Across the room, Dr. Harrison Reed was typing aggressively on a mechanical keyboard, updating patient charts, while Abigail Weston, a junior nursing assistant, restocked the supply closet. It was a perfectly mundane, quiet night. Until the glass doors exploded. It wasn't a push, it was a violent, desperate breach. The heavy glass shattered inward, raining down on the linoleum floor with a deafening crash that made Abigail scream and Evelyn instinctively dive over her son. 3 men burst through the threshold, dragging the storm in with them. They were soaked to the bone, tracking mud, shattered glass, and a thick, dark trail of fresh blood across the pristine floor. "Nobody move, get down. Get on the ground. Right now." The voice belonged to the leader, a heavily built man in a soaked leather jacket. His name was Dominic Russo. His eyes were wide white all around the irises, the universal sign of a massive, uncontrollable adrenaline dump. In his hands, he gripped a sawed-off Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. He was sweeping the barrel recklessly across the room, tracking from Evelyn to Dr. Reed, and finally to Sarah. Beside him was Caleb Miller, younger, leaner, and shaking like a leaf. Caleb held a Glock 19 handgun, his finger resting heavily on the trigger, violating every rule of firearm safety. His eyes darted around the room in pure paranoia. Between them, they were supporting the dead weight of Wyatt Fowler. Wyatt's face was the color of wet ash. His hands were clamped over his lower abdomen, but it wasn't enough. Dark arterial blood was pumping through his fingers, soaking his jeans and pooling on the linoleum. A botched armored car robbery 3 miles away had ended in a shootout with local police, and Wyatt had caught a hollow point round right beneath his ribcage. "Who's the doctor?" I said. "Who is the damn doctor?" Dominic roared, stepping further into the light, the smell of gunpowder, wet wool, and copper filling the sterile air. Dr. Reed, a brilliant physician, but a man who had never faced down the barrel of a 12-gauge shotgun, froze. His hands hovered over his keyboard, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Dominic didn't wait for an answer. He saw the scrubs. He lunged forward, closing the distance to the nurse's station in 3 long strides. He reached over the counter, his massive, calloused hand twisting into the fabric of Sarah's scrub top. With a violent jerk, he hauled her over the low counter. She hit the floor hard, crying out as her knee slammed into the tile. Before she could even catch her breath, Dominic hauled her to her feet by her hair, slamming her back against the nearest wall. The cold steel barrel of the shotgun was jammed brutally upward, right under her chin, forcing her to look into his erratic, bloodshot eyes. "You listen to me, sweetheart?" Dominic hissed his breath, hot and smelling of stale cigarettes. My brother is dying. You are going to fix him right now, or I swear to God I will paint this wall with your brains. Do you understand me, Nod?" Sarah began to shake. Her hands flew up, trembling violently, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "Please," she whimpered, her voice cracking in absolute terror. "Please, I'm just a nurse. I can't do surgery. Please don't hurt me." "I don't care what you are," Caleb screamed from across the room, pointing his Glock directly at Dr. Reed. "Save him. Please." Sarah sobbed, her shoulders heaving as she shrunk against the wall, the picture of complete hysterical submission. Dominic sneered in disgust, loosening his grip just a fraction, satisfied that the small, weak nurse was utterly broken. But if Dominic had been trained to look closer, he would have noticed something chilling. Yes, Sarah was crying. Yes, she was shaking. But beneath the facade of the terrified civilian, a switch had violently flipped deep inside her brain. The part of her that remembered what it felt like to be a civilian was gone, pushed down into a dark box. The woman who emerged in the span of 3 seconds was a ghost. Heart rate 65 beats per minute and dropping, breathing controlled shallow through the nose. While she cried and begged, Sarah's mind was instantly mapping the room with cold mechanical precision. Target 1, male heavy-build shotgun. Aggressive dominant tunnel vision on the injured man. Right-handed. Poor stance. Target 2, male slight build, Glock 19. Highly erratic. High flight or fight response. Finger on the trigger. Primary threat to civilians. Target 3, non-combatant. Severe abdominal trauma. Liver or descending aorta laceration. Estimated time until hemorrhagic shock 4 minutes. Sarah Taylor hadn't always been a small-town urgent care nurse. For 6 years, she was a Tier 1 medical operator attached to a highly classified Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC unit. She had treated gunshot wounds in the back of blacked-out helicopters over the Korangal Valley. She had cleared mud brick compounds in Syria, with a suppressed carbine in one hand and a trauma kit in the other. She knew the mechanics of human anatomy intimately, both how to save a life and, if absolutely necessary, exactly how to end one in fractions of a second. She continued to sob, letting her knees buckle slightly to appear even smaller. Dominic had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that because she was a woman in scrubs, she was prey. He didn't know he was holding a wolf by the ears. "Get him to the back, now," Dominic barked, finally pulling the shotgun away from Sarah's chin, but keeping the barrel leveled at her chest. "Move." Okay, Sarah cried, holding her hands up defensively. "Trauma Bay 1. It's right down the hall. Just don't shoot, please." "Help us carry him, you useless piece of trash," Caleb yelled at Dr. Reed. Harrison practically tripped over his own feet, rushing forward to grab Wyatt's legs, while Caleb and Dominic supported his shoulders. Sarah led the way, stumbling slightly, playing the part perfectly. She needed them in Trauma Bay 1. It was an enclosed room, roughly 15 by 15 feet, with a heavy sliding door and no windows. If she was going to turn this situation around, she needed to isolate the primary threats from the rest of the hostages. "Yukatuhoras." Dominic pointed the shotgun at Abigail, who was huddled behind the front desk, crying silently. "And you two?" He aimed at Evelyn, who had her arms wrapped tightly around little Leo. "Get in there with them. We're all staying together. Move." Sarah's internal threat calculus updated. Damn it. She had wanted the hostages left in the main room, away from the crossfire. Now they were all being herded into a fatal funnel. This severely limited her options. She couldn't use gross violence or improvised explosives if the blast radius or backstop included an innocent mother and a 5-year-old child. They crowded into the small, brightly lit trauma bay. The metallic smell of blood instantly intensified. They hoisted Wyatt onto the central gurney. He was gurgling now, his airway compromising, as his body went into shock. "Fix him!" Dominic yelled, shoving Sarah hard against the edge of the metal gurney. Sarah immediately went to work, her hand still trembling for show, but her movements efficient. She grabbed trauma shears from the counter and aggressively cut away Wyatt's bloody shirt. The wound was horrific. A massive exit wound in his lower back meant the bullet had tumbled through his internal organs. I need pressure on this," Sarah stammered, looking at Caleb. "He's bleeding out too fast. I can't start an IV unless the bleeding stops." "You, put your hands right here and push down as hard as you can." Caleb hesitated, gripping his Glock tighter. "Do it yourself. If I don't get an IV line in his heart, stops in 2 minutes." Sarah screamed back, channeling her manufactured panic perfectly. "Do what she says, Caleb." Dominic ordered, his eyes glued to his dying brother's pale face. Caleb swore violently, stepping up to the gurney. He didn't holster his weapon. Instead, he kept the Glock in his right hand, awkwardly pressing down on Wyatt's abdomen with his left hand and the side of his right wrist. Perfect, Sarah thought. Target 2's primary weapon is now physically entangled with the patient. His mobility is severely restricted. She moved around to the head of the bed, opening cabinets, pulling out saline bags, IV tubing and gauze. While she appeared to be frantically searching for medical supplies, she was actually building an armory. Improvised Weapon 1. A heavy, solid steel D cylinder of medical oxygen. It weighed about 14 pounds. If swung with enough force, it could crush a human skull like a melon. She quietly unlatched it from the wall bracket, leaving it precariously balanced on the counter. Improvised Weapon 2. A number 10 surgical scalpel. Short, razor-sharp. Useless for a slashing attack against heavy leather jackets, but lethal if driven directly into the carotid artery or the subclavian notch. She palmed it, sliding it discreetly into the deep right pocket of her scrub pants. Improvised Weapon 3. A glass ampule of epinephrine. "Hurry up!" Dominic roared, pacing back and forth near the sliding door. He pulled a police scanner out of his pocket. The radio traffic was frantic. The police had found their abandoned getaway car a mile down the road. They were setting up a perimeter. They were trapped, and Dominic knew it. The realization made the air in the room dangerously thin. Desperate men do not negotiate. They lash out. Suddenly, a loud clatter echoed in the small room. In her terror, Evelyn's grip had slipped. Little Leo dropped the hard plastic toy truck he had been clutching. It bounced off the linoleum floor, the noise sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. Leo let out a sharp, terrified wail. Caleb snapped. The stress, the blood, and the noise broke his fragile psyche. He pulled his hands off Wyatt's bleeding abdomen, raised his Glock 19, and pointed it directly at the crying 5-year-old. "Shut him up!" Caleb screamed, his finger whitening on the trigger. "Shut that kid up right now, or I swear to God, I'll put a bullet in him!" Evelyn screamed, throwing her body entirely over her son. Dr. Reed shouted something incomprehensible. Dominic spun around, raising his shotgun toward the noise, distracted by his partner's sudden meltdown. For exactly 1.5 seconds, nobody in the room was looking at the terrified, weeping nurse. Sarah Taylor stopped crying. The facade dropped completely. Her eyes went dead flat, her face turning to stone. The timeline had just accelerated. SWAT wasn't coming in time to save that little boy. Negotiation was no longer an option. Violence of action. It was a core tenet of close-quarters combat. When outnumbered and outgunned, you must overwhelm the enemy with sheer, unadulterated speed and aggression before their brains can process that the dynamic has changed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached out and grabbed the heavy 14-pound steel oxygen cylinder she had prepped on the counter. Her grip tightened on the cold metal. She took one silent gliding step forward, positioning herself directly behind Dominic's blind spot. He was still yelling at Caleb, the shotgun lowered just an inch as he tried to de-escalate his own partner. Sarah inhaled sharply, her core tightening. She swung the heavy steel cylinder in a brutal, horizontal arc. She didn't aim for his head. She aimed for the biomechanical weak point. The heavy steel violently impacted the side of Dominic's right knee. There was a sickening, wet crack as the joint shattered inward, completely destroyed in a fraction of a second. Dominic Russo's scream was a guttural tearing sound that vibrated off the sterile white tiles. Before his brain could fully process the catastrophic structural failure of his right leg, gravity ripped him downward. The sawed-off Remington 870 fired wildly into the ceiling, the deafening blast of the 12-gauge shell blowing out the overhead fluorescent light and showering the room in sparks and powdered drywall. The trauma bay plunged into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the flickering emergency backup lights and the amber glow of the medical monitors. Human reaction time to an unexpected auditory stimulus is roughly 0.17 seconds. For Caleb, whose central nervous system was already flooded with toxic levels of adrenaline, the time was effectively doubled. He heard the bone-crunching impact, followed by his brother's scream and the explosive gunshot, but his brain completely short-circuited. He flinched, pulling the Glock 19 slightly away from little Leo's head to look over his shoulder. That was his fatal error. Sarah didn't wait to watch Dominic hit the floor. The instant the steel cylinder connected with the knee, she dropped the heavy tank and pivoted entirely on her left foot, stepping laterally off the X, the fatal funnel of Caleb's line of fire. She closed the 3 feet between them in a blur of motion. Caleb's eyes widened, recognizing the sudden movement, but his neuromuscular system simply couldn't respond fast enough. Sarah's left hand struck out like a viper, clamping viciously over the top of the Glock's slide. She squeezed with a vice-like grip, physically pushing the slide slightly out of battery. If he pulled the trigger now, the firing pin would not strike the primer. The weapon was dead. Simultaneously, her right hand plunged into her scrub pocket and whipped out the number 10 surgical scalpel. She didn't aim for the neck or the chest. A dying man could still pull a trigger. She needed mechanical failure. With surgical precision, born from thousands of hours of anatomical study, she drove the razor-sharp blade deep into the inside of Caleb's right bicep, dragging it violently across the brachial plexus. Caleb shrieked a high-pitched sound of pure agony. The nerve cluster was severed. His hand went completely numb, his fingers popping open involuntarily. Sarah ripped the Glock from his useless hand. But the fight was only half over. On the floor, Dominic was thrashing, screaming in pain, but his survival instinct was kicking in. He was scrambling, trying to lever the pump-action shotgun up with one hand, swinging the barrel blindly toward the center of the room. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She flowed. She grabbed the collar of Caleb's leather jacket, violently pulling him in front of her as a human shield, while she simultaneously tapped the back of the Glock's slide, forcing it back into battery. The weapon was now hot. Dominic's finger found the shotgun's trigger. He saw a silhouette and squeezed. The blast ripped through the air, but Sarah had already anticipated the firing arc. She kicked the back of Caleb's knee, dropping him to the floor, and crouched perfectly behind the falling man. The buckshot shredded the drywall a foot above her head, missing the hostages entirely. Before Dominic could pump the action for a third shot, Sarah rose from her crouch. Her stance was textbook isosceles weight, slightly forward, both eyes open. Pop. Pop. 2 suppressed, highly controlled shots echoed in the tight space. Sarah didn't shoot to kill. She shot to disable. The first 9mm hollow-point round shattered Dominic's right collarbone, severing the muscle group required to hold the heavy weapon. The second round tore through his right bicep. The Remington clattered uselessly to the linoleum. Dominic collapsed onto his back, gasping, staring at the ceiling in absolute paralytic shock. Caleb, clutching his bleeding arm, tried to scramble toward the sliding door with his good hand. Sarah stepped forward, her foot coming down heavily on his ankle, pinning him to the floor. In one fluid motion, she holstered the Glock into the waistband of her scrub pants, knelt, and drove her knee squarely into the center of Caleb's back, knocking the wind out of him. Her hands darted to his neck, applying a textbook carotid restraint. "Shh," Sarah whispered coldly, her voice entirely devoid of the terrified tremor from seconds ago. "Go to sleep." Caleb thrashed wildly for exactly 4 seconds before his eyes rolled back, his brain starved of oxygen. His body went limp. The trauma bay was suddenly terrifyingly quiet, save for the rhythmic, monotonous beeping of Wyatt's heart monitor and the ragged breathing of the hostages. The entire sequence from the shattering of Dominic's knee to Caleb losing consciousness had taken exactly 9 seconds. "Doctor." Harrison Reed was pressed flat against the wall, his hands covering his head, trembling violently. Evelyn had completely covered Leo, pressing him into the corner. Abigail was staring at Sarah with a look of incomprehensible horror and awe. Sarah stood up slowly. Her breathing was steady. Her hands were perfectly still. She reached down, picked up the shotgun, cleared the chamber, and tossed the ejected shell into the biohazard bin. "Doctor, Reed." Sarah said, her voice sharp, authoritative, and ringing with absolute command. Harrison flinched as if he had been struck. Yes." "Get up. The patient is entering hypovolemic shock. He needs 2 units of O-negative and immediate surgical intervention, or he dies in 3 minutes. Harrison stared at the blood-soaked floor, then at the 3 neutralized gunmen, and finally at his quiet, polite triage nurse. "Sarah." "What? What are you—" "I'm a nurse, doctor," she replied, picking up a roll of gauze and moving back to Wyatt's gurney. "And right now, I need you to do your job." Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, packing Wyatt's abdominal wound with hemostatic gauze while maintaining constant pressure. But her mind was still moving at light speed, sweeping the tactical board. 3 men, 2 weapons, but the police scanner in Dominic's pocket was still crackling on the floor. Wait, Sarah's eyes narrowed. The radio chatter from the police perimeter was frantic. They were clearing the abandoned getaway vehicle. "Dispatch 2 Bravo. Vehicle is clear. I repeat, vehicle is clear." Witness reports seeing 4 individuals flee the vehicle into the woods, heading east toward the commercial district. 4. Sarah's blood ran cold. There was a 4th man, and he wasn't in the room. Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the back of the clinic, the emergency loading dock, echoed with a heavy, hollow thud. Someone was trying to kick it in. "Abigail!" Sarah barked, tossing the nurse a pair of trauma shears. "Take over pressure on the wound. Do not stop pushing no matter what." "Where are you going?" Abigail cried, her hands shaking as she took Sarah's place at the gurney. "To finish my shift," Sarah said evenly. She pulled the Glock 19 from her waistband, checked the magazine 13 rounds remaining, and stepped out of the trauma bay, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her. The hallway leading to the back loading dock was long dark and lined with locked storage closets. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows against the walls. Sarah moved with a terrifying grace, her footsteps completely silent on the linoleum. She didn't walk. She stalked. Every movement was a muscle memory ingrained by her former commander, Master Sergeant David Bones Halliwell, of the Elite Intelligence Support Activity Task Force Orange. He had taught her how to hunt in the dark. Thud. Crack. The reinforced deadbolt on the back door splintered. The metal frame bowed inward. Sarah didn't rush to the door. That was a rookie mistake. Instead, she stepped back, pressing herself flat against the wall, just inside an intersecting corridor, utilizing the geometry of the room to create a fatal angle. She raised the Glock, aligning the tritium night sights perfectly with the center of the doorway. The door exploded inward, hitting the wall with a deafening crash. A man stepped through dripping wet, holding a heavy MAC-10 submachine gun. He was frantic, out of breath, looking wildly down the empty hallway. "Dom Caleb," he yelled, stepping fully into the corridor. He never saw her. "Drop the weapon." Sarah's voice echoed down the hall. It wasn't a shout. It was a cold, flat statement of fact that carried the weight of absolute certainty. The man spun toward the voice, raising the MAC-10, his finger whitening on the trigger. Sarah didn't give him the chance. She double-tapped the trigger. The first shot shattered his right kneecap, dropping him instantly. As he fell, the second shot struck the MAC-10 itself, violently ejecting it from his hands and sending it skittering uselessly down the hall. The man hit the floor, screaming, clutching his shattered leg. Sarah stepped out of the shadows, her weapon still trained on his chest. She walked over to the submachine gun, kicked it 30 feet away, and stood over the writhing man. "You should have stayed in the car," she whispered. 4 minutes later, the front glass of the clinic was lit up by the strobing red and blue lights of a dozen police cruisers and a heavily armored Bearcat. The local SWAT team breached the front entrance shields, raised assault rifles, sweeping the room, screaming for everyone to get on the ground. They expected a bloodbath. They expected a hostage situation, barricaded suspects and casualties. What they found stopped the lead entry team dead in their tracks. The waiting room was empty. They pushed down the hall and breached Trauma Bay 1. Inside, Dr. Harrison Reed and Abigail Weston were stabilizing a patient on the gurney. In the corner, a mother was rocking her child. And lined up perfectly against the wall were 3 heavily armed men. They were bound with thick medical zip ties. Dominic Russo had a perfectly applied combat tourniquet on his shattered arm, and his leg was splintered. Caleb was just waking up, groaning, his neck bruised, and his arm wrapped in thick pressure bandages. Standing at the sink, calmly washing the blood off her hands with antibacterial soap, was Nurse Sarah Taylor. The SWAT commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Miller, lowered his rifle slowly, staring at the carnage, the blood-soaked walls, and the neatly neutralized, perfectly triaged suspects. He looked at the heavy steel oxygen tank on the floor, the bloody scalpel resting on a metal tray, and the 2 disassembled firearms kicked into the corner. Who did this?" Captain Miller asked, his voice betraying his absolute bewilderment. Dr. Reed pointed a shaking, blood-stained finger at the sink. Sarah turned off the water. She dried her hands meticulously with a paper towel, tossed it into the trash, and offered the SWAT commander a polite, entirely professional smile. "They slipped," Sarah said mildly. "Are the paramedics outside bed? One needs an immediate transport to a level 1 trauma center, and the gentleman on the floor will require orthopedic surgery." The commander stared at her, then down at Dominic Russo, who was whimpering in pain, refusing to even look in the small blonde nurse's direction. The monster who had kicked the doors in 20 minutes ago was completely broken, terrified of the woman in the wrinkled blue scrubs. Sarah picked up her lukewarm cup of black coffee from the counter. She took a sip, grimaced at the taste, and looked at the clock. "If you don't mind, Captain," she said, pulling a fresh pair of nitrile gloves from the dispenser. "I still have an hour left on my shift. If you felt your heart pounding during Nurse Sarah's incredible story of survival and tactical brilliance, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love real-life heroics, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true stories of ordinary people revealing extraordinary hidden pasts. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Sarah's shoes?